Good evening. It's 8 o'clock in Yerushalayim. This is WebYeshiva.org, and it's time to begin our halacha shir. Our topic for this evening is LED bulbs, light-emitting diodes, on Shabbat and Yom Tov, switching them on, switching them off. And, well, we're going to see what the poskim have to say about the issues. The issues are, number one, whether or not uh, the light constitutes some kind of fire, and on Yom Tov, it's okay to switch them on because you can transfer fire. The permissibility of turning them on and off is one issue, and that pertains to Yom Tov. And the question of whether or not electrical apparatus, the general prohibition of electrical apparatuses, applies to LEDs, to light-emitting diodes. Well, let's get to the material and let the words of the poskim speak for themselves. Where do we have this? Click should get it. Voila. The underlying ideas are, of course, not discussed in the Mishnah or Gemara because they didn't have these electronic devices back in those days. Nonetheless, we can find some adumbrations. We can find some foreshadowing of the ideas in earlier literature. Let's see what the modern poskim have to say before the electronic period. Let's see what they have to say, which might shed a light on the subject at hand. I begin with the Aruch HaShulchan. Now, the Aruch HaShulchan is a heavyweight, and indeed all the sources I'm going to bring you are really the most important poskim. Although the opinions of lesser-known rabbis might be interesting, I'm going to focus only on the opinions of really the leading poskim of current generation and very, very recent generations. Aruch HaShulchan, his name was Rav Epstein, Rav Yechiel Michal Epstein. He was the Rav of Navardik in Eastern Europe. This was published in the beginning of the 20th century. Now, the Aruch HaShulchan happens to be one of my favorite books. I really like it. Let's see what he has to say about the issue here. Bidvar hadlakat ha'elektri b'yom tov. As far as turning on electrical apparatuses on Shabbos is concerned, and back in those days, they had just recently electrified the town. Electrical apparatuses back in those days meant electric lights. That's what they had. And as far as switching lights on is concerned, איך אפשר להדליק אור האלקטרי ביום טוב, אחרי שאין מדליקים אור זה על ידי נר אחר. Everyone knows that on Yom Tov, it's correct, it's permissible to transfer fire from one source to another. You can take a candle and light another candle. Everyone knows that. But if you switch on an electric light on Yom Tov, well, where's the existing fire that you're transferring into the light bulb, if the light bulb is to be considered fire at all? Raka or nolad. What happens is the electrons bump into each other and they produce a new light in the light bulb. The light produced in the new light bulb is a new light produced by the electrons bumping together. And well, back in those days, of course, it was incandescent lights, but I assume there's no reason why I wouldn't say exactly the same thing about LEDs, about light-emitting diodes. Now, at this point, he is assuming that you are familiar with the halachic definition of fire. Now, when we want to define fire from the halachic point of view, of course, we're not going to be terribly concerned with what chemists have to say. Chemistry is the science of the molecule, and the chemists are happy to explain how oxidation works, how oxidation works with different molecules, and how the combustion is maintained spontaneously. Well, the whole chemical understanding of combustion, having to do primarily with oxidation, this whole understanding requires knowledge of and understanding of molecules, which of course They didn't have back in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu. They did not have back in the days of the Mishnah, the Gemara, the Rambam, and so forth and so on. And therefore, a halachic definition of fire, which depends on an understanding of molecules and the way they interact with each other, an understanding which depends upon the science of chemistry, cannot possibly suit the halachic definition of fire. We have to be able to define fire in terms which would have been understood in the days of Moshe Rabbeinu, in the days of the in late antiquity, in the Middle Ages, and into early modernity. And that's exactly the maskana, the conclusion which the poskim have. Back in those days, the idea, the halachic concept of fire was ochel ve'eno shoter. Let me get that on chat. Ochel ve'eno shoter. Fire is something which eats and does not drink. Fire, the definition of fire is something which is ochel ve'eno shoter. It eats but does not drink. That is, fire consumes, fire grows and can consume other things. You put a little flame into the haystack and it will eat up the whole haystack. Fire consumes, it eats, ve'eno shoter, but does not drink. If you pour water on it, you will extinguish it. Oh, that's the way poskim understood the definition of fire before modern chemistry came around, and that is the halachic definition of fire. Ochel ve'eno shoter. So in the light bulb, there seemingly was no fire prior to switching on the light bulb, and therefore you're not transferring fire, you're creating a new fire, prohibited on Yom Tov, and all the more so prohibited on Shabbos. Lahadlik or ha'elektri b'Yom Tov, but as far as switching the electric lights on Shabbos is concerned, near la'ani adati, it seems, in my humble opinion, he writes very modestly, it seems in my humble opinion, lahatir, it seems correct to me to permit switching on electric lights on Yom Tov. Ein zeh molid eish b'Yom Tov. You're not really creating a new fire on Yom Tov when you switch on the electric light. Kamo b'chikuch et atzei gafrit. It's not like striking a match, where when you strike a match, you are creating a new flame. It's not like that. Tivasham eina eitzim ein be'eitzim koach etzem ha'esh. Because when you strike a match, the match, before you strike it, did not have the power of fire in it. It was dead. Ela yesod ha'esh bo mirubeh behitachacho nolad ha'esh. The fire is created in a match only through the rubbing of the match on another surface. They didn't have safety matches back in those days. You could strike the match on any rough surface. Aval bazeh ha'elektri yesh koach esh mamash. But in the wires which carry the electricity, there's the power of fire, mamish. There's really the power of fire in the wires. Elish ain't no meir, it's just not lighting up anything yet, but the power already exists in the wires. Hipagesh shnei kochot hanegdiim zeh lazeh chiyuv v'slila. When positive pole touches negative pole and you make an electrical connection, positive pole touches negative pole, you make an electrical connection, yetzei ha'esh b'poal, then the fire appears. But it was always there in the wires. It just didn't come out until you connected the positive pole with the negative pole. It's just like coals, which at the moment look dead, but if you blow on them, the flame will come out. The flame was always in the coals. It just needed a little bit more oxygen blowing on it in order for the flame to come out. That you're allowed to do on Yom Tov. And just like the fire already exists in the coals, so it already exists in the wires. Just like the breath when you blow on the coals is just adding another force to make the fire apparent. Similarly, connecting the wires is just making the fire apparent. That's the way electricity works, and therefore you're allowed to do that on Yom Tov. And well, um, in my grandparents' generation, not so long ago, I'm not that old, but in my grandparents' generation, many the Torah observant Jews were following exactly this position, and on Yom Tov they were switching on electric lights. Now the text continues. These are still the words of the Aruch HaShulchan. Oh, furthermore, kishepoteach petach haelektri, when you open up the electric circuit, when you bring the wires together so that the current can flow, eino ella kemikarev ha'oretzlo, you're just bringing the force of the fire closer to the light bulb. Bisagro marhiko, and when you open the circuit, you separate the wires, you're just keeping the source of the fire separate from the light bulb. Afilu im nomashu gorem laholodat or lo ashkachan grama da'aser. Even if you want to tell me that this is only causation, bringing the wires together is only causation, even if you want to tell me that you're only causing the fire to appear in the light bulb, well, that's also okay, because grama, let's get that spelled correctly on chat, grama, causation, is permitted on Yom Tov, not on Shabbos, but on Yom Tov, grama is simply permitted. Ein kan ma'aseh shenomar she'oseh ma'aseh lahotzi, or b'Yom Tov, switching on electric lights is not creating a new fire on Yom Tov, and all is well. Lehedia, I'm reading b'Shabbos, the Gemara says flat out, asiyahu da'asa. Asiyahu da'asa. The Gemara says flat out that only direct actions are prohibited on Shabbos, on Yom Tov. Grama, on the other hand, indirect causation on Yom Tov is entirely permitted. Harebekan eno ela kapoteach petach. Here, when you switch on the electric light, it's rather like opening up a window and letting the wind come in, and the wind will effectuate some action. That's indirect causation, entirely permissible on Yom Tov. That's what it seems. That seems to be correct in my humble opinion. Lefi havanati, this is my understanding of the way electricity works. Ki ena mitsuya barov ha'arem shalanu. Most cities in our area, is Lithuania, the beginning of the 20th century. Most cities in our area do not have electricity yet. They're not yet electrified. But he saw how it works, and that's how he understands it. Therefore, lo nuchal la'amod b'diuk al totzatav. We cannot investigate the workings of electricity very carefully, because most of our cities don't even have it yet. He signs it with his name in Navardik and so forth and so on. Well, here's one great Ashkenaz authority who clearly views the electric force as being fire, and now we have to work with the principles of fire. On Shabbat, prohibited. On Yom Tov, permitted, as long as you're not creating a new fire on Yom Tov. And he holds this is not a new fire. Well, that's one of the great Ashkenaz authorities. What about the great Sephardic authorities of modern times? Well, here we have a tshuva of the Mishpatei Uziel. And in the course of the class today, I'm not going to bother telling you exactly where I draw the sources from, because you always have the exact chapter numbers and the paragraph numbers and so forth on the screen if you want to look up the sources and see what my typographical errors are, because I'm not a great typist. Mishpatei Uziel that we're about to look at was written by Rav Ben Zion Chai Uziel, one of the great Sephardic poskim of the 20th century. He was the Rav Harashi. He was the chief Sephardic rabbi of Israel, the Rishon LeZion, back in the days of Rav Kook. Rav Kook was the Ashkenaz, and he was the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel back in those days. Of course, Rav Kook was the first Ashkenaz chief rabbi. That position did not exist before Rav Kook. Rav Uziel, on the other hand, was part of a very long tradition going back through the generations of chief Sephardic rabbis in Israel. After all, the Ashkenazim in Yerushalayim, in Eretz Yisrael in general, and in Yerushalayim in specific, the Ashkenazim are only right recently, and therefore only recently have a chief rabbi. In any event, he's writing what he's writing in the 1930s, and let's see what he has to say about electricity and fire. Nirlani Adaiti, it seems, in my humble opinion, Lamar, one must say, Vadai ein le'esor hadlakat chashmal meta'am nolad. We absolutely cannot prohibit switching on electric lights because of nolad, because you're giving birth to a new fire. There is no nolad, no birth of a new fire here, and that would be prohibited on Yom Tov, but that's not what's happening. Shaharei, because hadlakat hashmal eino molid or ela moshech zerem ha'ara ne'echezet b'chutim hatakim she'betoch hashishit. The way electricity works is that the fire, the light, is already in the thin wires which lead to the light bulb, and in the light bulb there's a filament. These were incandescent bulbs back in those days. We're not yet ready to talk about actual LEDs, but the filament, the wire in the light bulb, already has the power of light in it, the power of fire. It just has to be revealed. ואין זה אלא מבעיר אש מצויה שהיא נמצאת עומדת קודם ומתגלה בהסרת המעצור. Since the fire, the light already exists in the wires coming all the way from the generating plant, all you have to do is remove the impediment to that fire. There's an air gap between the two wires. Remove the impediment, the air gap between the two fires. Bring the two wires together, and the electricity will just flow into the light bulb. That's an existing fire just being brought into the light bulb. This will cause the light bulb to glow. Lachein, therefore, ein bahadlakat me'or hashmal lo mishum molid, lo mishum nolad. Switching on electric lights on Shabbos is not an issue of nolad, of giving birth to anything new. The fire already existed in the wires. You're just eliminating the impediment for the fire to flow into the light bulb, and it glows. Mutar, it's permissible. Lisabev hamafteach, it's permissible to switch on lights. In those days, the switches had to be rotated. You had to rotate the switch, thereby bringing the two wires together. Olitchok bekaftor, well, they had these switches which you could activate by pushing. Well, it doesn't matter what the mechanism is for bringing the wires together. It's permitted. Kedei liftoach zerem chashmal sheyachdor, that will permit the power of the fire to go through the wires into the light bulb and in the light. So the idea of the permissibility of switching on lights was quite common both among Sephardic and Ashkenaz authorities from the early to the middle of the 20th century. And as I said, in my grandparents' generation, this position was commonly embraced by Torah observant Jews in Europe, North Africa, and North America. Now, at this point, I want to make a methodological observation. The methodological observation has a name to it. The name is Halacha Ke'aharon. Here we have this typed correctly on chat. Halacha ke aharon, the normative halacha, the definitive, the obligatory halacha, where there are disagreements among the poskim. The definitive opinion is the more recent opinion. When in the course of generations there's a machloket, a disagreement between the earlier authorities and the more recent authorities, so the methodological rule of halakha ke'acharon demands that normative practice be in accord with the more recent authorities. Halakha ke'acharon, halacha follows the more recent authorities where there is a disagreement between earlier and more recent authorities. Now, if you think about it for a moment, this rule of halachic decision making, this rule of deciding the halacha in accord with the more recent opinions, the existence of this rule, and this is a rule more or less universally embraced by the great poskim, the existence of this rule is sufficient to demonstrate that the body of halacha is, historically speaking, a growing, developing, evolving, changing system. After all, if the body of halacha were not a growing, changing, evolving system over the centuries, then there could not be a principle of halacha ka'acharon, where there is a disagreement between earlier and later authorities. You must follow the more recent authorities. Now, the underlying logic, the underlying reasoning of this principle is fairly simple and straightforward, and is by no means limited to halachic thinking. Legal systems all over the world, lahavdil, embrace a similar principle. Just imagine a case where some criminal case before some criminal court in who cares what country under non-Jewish law. Just imagine the non-Jewish lawyer defending his criminal defendant, speaking to the judge along the following terms. Just imagine the lawyer saying, "Judge, it's correct that my client committed the crime just as he or she is accused of. That's true. But Judge, please decide the law not in accord with contemporary law, but in the 16th century, what he did was not considered a crime. Please decide the case in accord with law as it was in earlier generations when this was not a crime at all." Well, the silliness of this position is evident. Of course, whether it's halacha or a non-Jewish legal system, lahavdil, of course, it's the most recent form, the most recent status of the legal system, the halachic system, which must dominate. So at this point in time, early and mid 20th century, the leniency of switching on electronic apparatus is quite widely embraced. As soon as we get down to the second half of the 20th century, rabbis changed their mind. And I have here the text of the Chazon Ish, just as a representative of the stricter side. And the position we're about to see, in the words of the Chazon Ish, becomes the position which is then universally embraced by more recent rabbis, a stricter position. Chazon Ish, family name was Karelitz, Rav Karelitz, and he was originally from Lithuania. And the book we're about to quote from, the Chazon Ish, was originally published when he was in Lithuania before he came to Eretz Yisrael. He came to Eretz Yisrael, founded the religious community of Bnei Brak, which then was outside of Tel Aviv. Well, today, technically speaking, it still is outside of Tel Aviv. It's a separate jurisdiction, but it's really been incorporated into the greater Tel Aviv area. You know, when you cross the street from Bnei Brak into Tel Aviv or into Ramat Gan, you really don't realize that you've stepped across a border into another jurisdiction. In any event, he published this book anonymously in Europe before coming to Eretz Yisrael, and the book gained immense popularity, and only later was it revealed that he was the author. Let's see what he has to say about closing electrical circuits on Shabbos. He says, and this is the opinion which became embraced by by huge number of contemporary rabbis. Yesh bazeh mishum tikkun mana. Closing an electric circuit, bringing the wires together, is a violation of Shabbat or Yom Tov under the rubric of tikkun mana. Tikkun mana means fixing a utensil. Tikkun, fixing, mana, a utensil. Tikkun mana, fixing a utensil. The idea is as follows. I'll give you the example of the Gemara. You'll understand right away, and we'll be able to multiply examples very quickly. Uh, the final hammer blow, which the artisan which the blacksmith must make, the final hammer blow to make the horseshoe a usable horseshoe, the final hammer blow to make the utensil a usable utensil, whether it's a horseshoe or anything else, the final hammer blow, that is tikkun mana, that is making the utensil, and therefore prohibited min haTorah, Torah prohibition on Shabbat and Yom Tov. Well, how many people? We don't have many blacksmiths nowadays. I don't know what happened to all of them, but still, this is a problem which comes up in everyday Shabbos observance and everyday Yom Tov observance. I'll give you a more modern example, and you'll see how it works. Um, uh, uh, Shoes. Well, perhaps I reveal my age here, but back in my days, when you bought a pair of shoes, you bought a pair of new shoes. The first thing you did when you brought the shoes home was you have to lace up the shoes. You have to put the shoelaces in it, and of course, uh, that was one of the jobs you have when you buy new shoes. The shoes are useless. You can't wear them. They just fall off your feet until you put the shoelaces in. Lacing up the shoes for the first time is tikkun mana. That is making the shoes usable utensils. That's prohibited on Shabbat and Yom Tov. Of course, if you have been wearing the shoes and the shoelace breaks and you want to replace the shoelace on Shabbos or Yom Tov, that's okay. It already was a usable utensil. You already were using the shoe, and therefore putting in new laces is fine. That's acceptable on Shabbos, but it's the initial lacing which is prohibited. Well, according to the Chazon Ish, switching on the electrical apparatus, whether it's a light bulb or anything else, falls under the prohibition of tikkun mana. Kevan shema'amido al techunato, because by switching it on, you make it work the way it is designed to work. Lizrom hazerem hachashmal b'tamidas. This allows the current to flow steadily into it, and now the apparatus works the way it's intended to work. It's dead until you switch it on, and now the apparatus is functioning the way the instrument is supposed to function. Karov adavar dezer bona min haTorah ke'oseh kli. It's like making a utensil. This is a subcategory of bona. Bona construction, building is not only houses, but bona construction is anything that you build, anything that you complete. And that's what's happening when you switch on an electrical apparatus. Kol shekain, all the more so. B'menorah, all the more so in a light bulb. Shekol hachutim b'chubarim labayit, all the more so in a light bulb where the wires which are powering the light bulb are attached to the house. And since it's attached to the house, it's mechubar, and building is a far more serious violation on Shabbos and Yom Tov if you're really building a house, a structure which is attached to the ground, and the electrical wires are all attached to the ground. They didn't have battery operated stuff in those days, but electric wires, the mains, are attached to the ground, far more serious than ordinary making of a utensil. Ein kan mishum binyan bekalim. We're not talking about merely completing a utensil. We're talking about real construction work, like it's part of the house, and you're completing the structure of the house. Switching on an electric apparatus is tikkun mana, it's bona. There are many reasons why it is a Torah prohibition. Now, this position of the Chazon Ish gained great popularity. And I speak about popularity in rabbinic circles. Many, many great rabbis have embraced this idea. And according to this, it really doesn't matter what the electrical apparatus is, light emitting diode or anything else. Switching it on is clearly a Torah violation on Shabbos and Yom Tov, and that more or less ends the discussion. There's not a whole lot more to talk about. How do I turn the page? Voila. But not all rabbis embrace this position. Let's look at the opposing view, the view which opposes the Chazon Ish, the view which rejects his underlying premises. The great Rav whom we're going to look at is Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. He was on anyone's short list of all-time great poskim, and among other things, he was a chavrusa. He lives in Yerushalayim, but he used to travel to Bnei Brak, where the Chazon Ish lived, and they used to study together. They were study partners for quite a long time, and indeed. Well, if you study their respective books, you'll discover very quickly there's very little they agreed upon. Even though they were study partners for a long time, the positions embraced by the Chazon Ish and those embraced by the Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach in his writings, all very often are at loggerheads. They didn't agree about very much, and they did not agree about the principles of electricity, the halachas which govern electrical apparatuses. They didn't agree at all. We're going to see a quotation from the Minchas Shlomo, and note that I'm quoting this from the first volume of his Tshuvot, the first volume of his Responsa. This volume was published in his lifetime under his supervision. Subsequent volumes of the set were published posthumously, and I'm always a little bit nervous about the authenticity of books that get published posthumously. After all, these great rabbis, whether it's Shlomo Zalman or any of the other great rabbis, they answered a huge number of halachic questions, and when their opinions get published posthumously, I always wonder whether or not they would have intended to publish that themselves in their lifetime. Maybe the only reason they said what they said was because of some weird, bizarre circumstances in the case at hand, and given some bizarre, weird circumstances in the case at hand, they said such and such, they said it, but of course they would never have published it as a general hora'ah, as a general instruction for the Jewish people, because it only applies in certain weird, bizarre cases. Well, I'm always a little bit nervous about posthumously published tshuvas, but this he published himself in his lifetime, and not only that, he and the Chazon Ish corresponded by mail, by post. Back in those days, people wrote on paper and they put it in an envelope with a stamp on it. You see it in the old movies. It's called post, mail. They mailed letters back and forth on exactly this issue. Reb Shlomo Zalman arguing that the Chazon Ish was simply wrong in his understanding, in his halachic understanding of electrical apparatuses, switching them on and off, and that correspondence going back and forth was published by Reb Shlomo Zalman. All those letters back and forth are available, and what we're about to see is an extract of those letters, which he published in his first volume of Responsa. Okay, let's see what Reb Shlomo Zalman has to say about switching electrical apparatuses on and off. Nira la'ani yodaiti. You've got the phrase We've seen this phrase so many times already. It seems, in my humble opinion, that's the way poskim always often introduce their words. No one told him, I did not tell him, no one told him he had to publish this. The very fact that he chose to publish it means he's entirely committed to this position, even though he expresses himself so modestly. This is his thinking. Ein isur lehaf'il hazerem b'Shabbos. There is no prohibition to switch on electrical current on Shabbos, powering an electrical apparatus, ela mehamata totza'ah shena'aseh al yidei hachashmal, unless the result is going to be a prohibited result. Kamo, for example, bishul v'hadlaka, for example, cooking or lighting something up. Let me explain in simple terms what he's talking about. There is no prohibition in switching on an electrical apparatus on Shabbos unless that apparatus performs a prohibited activity on Shabbos. Switch on an electric mill which is going to grind flour on Shabbos, grind wheat into flour. Well, you're guilty of grinding wheat into flour on Shabbos. Switch on an electric kettle and you boil water. Well, you're guilty of cooking on Shabbos. Switch on an electrical apparatus which does whatever it does, but does not violate any of the prohibited activities on Shabbos, well, you didn't do anything wrong. The specific example, the specific context in which he said this has to do with opening up a refrigerator door. Now, as you know, refrigerators have built into them a thermostat which measures the temperature in the chamber of the refrigerator, and the compressor, the mechanism in the refrigerator which cools the refrigerator, that's the compressor, compresses a gas into liquid. That liquid then is allowed to evaporate, and it's the evaporation of that liquid into a gas which cools the chamber. Then the compressor compresses it back into liquid. It's allowed to evaporate again, cooling the chamber more. And there's a thermostat controlling the compressor. When the chamber gets cold enough, the compressor is switched off. When the temperature rises to a certain point, the compressor is switched back on again, and the cooling cycle begins again. That's the way they work. You don't have to be Norbert Wiener to understand the feedback system which is working here. Now, the question therefore arises, are you allowed to open up the refrigerator door while the motor is silent, while the compressor is not working? If you open up the refrigerator door while the motor is silent, while the compressor is not working, by opening up the refrigerator door, cold air flows out of the refrigerator chamber. Ambient atmosphere from the room, warmer air enters the chamber, and therefore the temperature in the chamber rises every time you open the refrigerator door. And therefore, if you open the door when the motor is silent, when the compressor is switched off, you run the risk of clicking the thermostat to the temperature, which is going to reactivate the motor and get the refrigerator working again to cool itself down again. Are you allowed to do that? They asked him. Answer: well, compressing a gas into a liquid falls under none of the 39 categories of prohibited labor on Shabbos. The compressor is not doing anything which is in violation of Shabbos, and therefore there's no particular prohibition to switch it on directly. To run the risk of switching it on by opening up the door, all the more so is permitted, because even if you knew for sure that you're directly switching on the compressor, you're not causing any violation of Shabbos at all, simply permitted. Now, that's a powerful idea. According to this, electrical apparatuses are permitted until switching them on, switching them off is permitted until we can demonstrate that the apparatus is doing something which is a violation of one of the 39 categories of prohibited labor on Shabbos. Now, as far as the older incandescent bulbs were concerned, you still see them around here and there. There's still some of them around. The those are the ones that get very hot. They're very wasteful as far as electricity consumption is concerned. A lot of the energy goes into heat, and you want to use the more efficient LEDs, the more efficient light bulbs, where the energy goes into light and very little of it goes into heat. In any event, uh, uh, the Rambam says flat out, and this is universal opinion of all the poskim. I just quote the Rambam as an example. The prohibition of bishul on Shabbos, the prohibition of cooking, is not limited to food and liquid. Of course, when we talk about cooking, that's usually what we're talking about. But the Gemara talks about cooking dyes to color wool. That has nothing to do with food, but that's also cooking. And indeed, one of the underlying idea of cooking is using heat to harden or to soften something. You use heat to cook a chicken, you're softening the meat. Use heat to cook an egg, you're hardening the egg. Using heat to harden or to soften something, that's the idea of cooking. And therefore, the Rambam and the poskim say flat out, using heat to soften metal, that's what a blacksmith does. You heat the metal. By heating it, you soften the metal. Now you can use your hammer and anvil and work the metal into the shape you want because the metal is softer. Cool the metal down, it hardens into shape. Heating the metal, and how hot does it have to be guilty of cooking? Heating it to the state where it glows red hot, that is a Torah violation of cooking on Shabbos. And that's exactly what happens in an incandescent light bulb. The filament is heated to the temperature that it begins to glow. That's what an incandescent bulb is or was. And so switching it on is clearly a violation of bishul on Shabbos. But switching on a fan that just blows the air around the room, no particular violation in that. It's none of the 39 categories of prohibited labor are violated there. And according to the Minchas Shlomo, shouldn't be prohibited at all. שמתייחס אליו ונחשב כאילו הוא מבשל ומדליק בידיים, if the apparatus you switch on is going to grind wheat into flour, is going to boil water, is going to do whatever it does, which is one of the 39 prohibited labors, well, you've done one of the 39 prohibited labors and you're guilty. Masha ein kain im kol hatotza'ah mehafalat hazerem, but if the only result of switching on the apparatus, usha gaz mitrasesu mitadeh b'mikarer, is only going to be causing evaporation or condensation of gas and liquid in the refrigerator, if that's all you're doing, ein ani yodea eze isur yesh b'davar. I don't know why that should be prohibited. We have no authority now that the Sanhedrin no longer exists. Right, the Sanhedrin, back in the days of the temple, was a legislative body, judicial body, and also legislative body. When we speak about rabbinic law, dinim de rabbanan, rabbinic law, we're talking about law that was legislated by the Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin had the authority to legislate. Moshe Rabbeinu appointed this Kenim, right? Yisro, Moshe Rabbeinu's father-in-law, came and gave him advice to set up the Sanhedrin. He set up the Sanhedrin, and through the generations, every Sanhedrin perpetuated itself into the next Sanhedrin. Through the generations, they had the authority to legislate, but the Sanhedrin no longer exists nowadays, and for various reasons, which we'll discuss in another series of Shiurim, it's impossible to reconstitute the Sanhedrin nowadays. We have no authority to legislate new law, new rabbinic law, and since the rabbis in the Sanhedrin never prohibited electrical apparatuses, well, they didn't know about it. How could they prohibit it? It remains permitted. Now, of course, there are plenty of things they didn't know about in those days. They didn't know about automobiles, but still, driving an automobile on Shabbos is prohibited. After all, the way an internal combustion engine works is that the petrol, the gas, is burned in the cylinder. Well, that's mavir, that's burning. Lo tiva'aru eish b'chol mosherotechem b'yom Shabbat. The Torah says, don't light any fires in your communities on the Shabbos. On Shabbos, lo tiva'aru eish. And that's exactly what you're doing in the cylinder in the when you drive an automobile. We're talking about electric cars in another context. So even though they didn't have cars in those days, it's clearly a Torah prohibition, but things which do not fall under any of the 39 prohibited labors and did not exist in those days, well, we have no authority to prohibit it today. Yesh b'hachnasat hazera mishum isur molid. We cannot create this new halacha by bringing electric wires together and causing a current to flow. We are molid. We're giving birth to something new. As much sense as this makes, we don't have the authority to legislate something like that. Now, at this point, let me add that Rav Shlomo Zalman wrote, despite all this, he himself wrote that he recommends refraining from switching on any electrical apparatus on Shabbos, even those which are halachically harmless, even those which don't do anything in violation of Shabbos, even though he's just explained to us why it is permitted to switch them on, he still advises against it. The basis of his advice is as follows. Back in the 18th century, before electrification, back in the 18th century, the Rabbi Yaakov Emden, the Avatz, used one of the two big names in the 18th century. He was asked about spring-driven apparatuses. They didn't have electrical stuff back then, but they did have spring-driven apparatuses. And he was asked about winding up a spring-driven apparatus on Shabbos, specifically a clock or any other spring-driven apparatus. He has a long tshuva on the matter. He comes to the conclusion after a lengthy discussion that it is permitted to wind up the apparatus. You're not making a new utensil. It was a working, functioning clock before it wound down. By winding it up, you're not giving birth to a new clock. You're not making a new utensil. You're just setting it in motion again. And therefore, even if the spring is wound down, you can wind it up again on Shabbos. After coming to that conclusion, Rabbi Yaakov Emden then says, even though I've just concluded that it's permitted to wind up the clock on Shabbos, I'm going to tell everyone that it is prohibited. I'm going to lie. I'm going to tell everyone that it's prohibited to wind up spring-driven apparatuses on Shabbos. The reason I'm going to advise everyone to refrain from winding up spring-driven apparatuses is because most people have no idea what's going on in the mechanism of the spring-driven device. And what happens inside that device when you wind it up? If something happens in there which is a violation of one of the 39 prohibitions of Shabbos, then of course you cannot wind it up. And how's an ordinary citizen supposed to know what's going on inside the mechanism of the spring-driven apparatus? Uh, well, this is something which the engineer understands, the engineer who designed it, but ordinary citizens cannot be expected to understand what's going on inside the mechanism. And therefore, some of these mechanisms, some spring-driven mechanisms, some of them are indeed violating Shabbos. And since ordinary people have no simple way of distinguishing which are the permitted and which are the prohibited spring-driven apparatuses, it's good advice to refrain from winding up any of them. Of course, good advice is good advice and not exactly the same as a halachic decision. When push comes to shove, if someone is suffering, for example, and winding up a spring-driven apparatus will relieve the suffering, and the a Torah observant engineer who understands everything that's going on inside the apparatus can certify that nothing is happening in violation of Shabbos in there. Well, it really is permitted. It's just good advice in general to refrain. Similarly, with electrical apparatuses, it's good advice, Rav Shlomo Zalman responded, to refrain in general from switching or using any electrical apparatus, because the truth is, even electrical engineers might have great difficulty figuring out exactly what's going on. After all, if I hit the send button on an email, sending out an email from my IP, from my computer, uh, even an electrical engineer will have the greatest difficulty figuring out exactly what happens after I've sent out those packets. I sent out my email message, which typically gets divided into very small packets. Each packet travels through an unpredictable route from node to node. Who knows what that route is through computers all over the world until all those packets get reassembled at their destination in the proper order. But who knows what happened to those signals en route? Even an electrical engineer might have difficulty figuring out everything that happens in all the devices which are being activated. But when push comes to shove, if, for example, someone is suffering and switching on an electrical apparatus will relieve the suffering, I'm not talking about life-threatening cases. There, of course, you can switch on electrical apparatus, but it's just garden variety suffering. If switching on an electrical apparatus will relieve the suffering, and a Torah observant electrical engineer can certify that switching on the apparatus is not violating any of the 39 categories of prohibited labor on Shabbos, then indeed it is permitted. It's good advice not to use it, but when it's needed, if it's permitted, go for it. It's actually okay. Now, this leads me to have a chazon. This leads me to have a dream for the future. After all, if you think about it for a moment, you realize that food chemistry has become, since the middle of the 20th century, food chemistry has become an extraordinarily complicated business. And we rely upon hechsher organizations. We rely upon rabbis who devote themselves to studying the food chemistry, understanding how foods are produced, checking out different factories all over the world, and certifying which factories are producing such and such in a kosher way. And as far as kashrus of food is concerned, we have learned to rely upon hechsherim. In earlier generations, when production of food was far simpler, there was no such thing as kashrus organizations which had to check out the food chemistry in factories. These things didn't exist in earlier generations. Food production was much simpler in those days. But just as we have learned to rely upon hechsher organizations which check out the technical details, the food chemistry in modern food production facilities, just as we've learned to rely upon these organizations in food matters and kashrus matters for food. It is my dream, my chazon, uh, vision for the future that we can have kashrus organizations to certify electronic devices, a certain home security system or a certain hotel security system might get the hechsher, the stamp of approval of well-known rabbis that no violation of Shabbos is involved, and that could be a sales point for the manufacturer of that system, increase their market share a little bit, and might be desirable from the manufacturer's point of view, and we'll know which systems are free of Shabbos violations. At the moment, uh, home security systems or hotel security systems, whatever they are, many of them are really quite complicated. And again, and even an electrical engineer might have difficulty figuring out everything that goes on within the system. But if the system can be examined by a Torah observant electrical engineer, if all is well, all is well, and that's all there is to it according to Rav Shlomo Zalman Auerbach. So we're left at this point with this mahloket, this disagreement between the Chazon Ish on the stricter side and Rav Shlomo Zalman on the more lenient side. Chazon Ish prohibiting electrical apparatus flat out for reasons we saw. Rav Shlomo Zalman recommending against, but bottom line permitting them in cases where there is no violation and there's need for them. Now, let's see if we can turn our attention more precisely to light emitting diodes. There's no need at the moment. I hope there's no need at the moment for understanding of quantum mechanics. You know, when I was younger and we studied quantum theory, it was all a lovely theory. But you know, back in those days when I was studying it, we didn't imagine that it's actually going to have a whole lot of practical use. And then came semiconductors, and you know the only way to explain how semiconductors work is quantum theory. There is no other way to explain how they work. And a light emitting diode is after all a semiconductor. The text we're about to look at is written by Rav Asher Weiss. Rav Asher Weiss, one of the leading rabbis in Eretz Yisrael today, even though he was born in America and grew up in America, he's still pretty good. He's one of the leading authorities in the rabbinic world today. Let's see what he has to say about electrical apparatuses in general and LEDs in specific. Ta'u, previous generations of rabbis made a mistake. Mishum shelo yadu klal mahut hashmal. Previous generations didn't understand how electricity works. And we see this from their writing. Katvu de'enze ela madlik kisim. They thought there's some fire traveling through the wires, which then becomes revealed when the light is switched on. They thought there was fire in the wires. But really, there's no basis whatsoever. There is no fire in the wires. Instead, Zrimata electronim meshachreret energia. There are energy waves passing through the wires, and those energy waves can be changed into heat, and that's what happens in the incandescent bulb. Davar chamur hu latzet divrei gedolim ba'atzmam shehem kotvim al pi umdina. It's wrong to rely upon what these earlier rabbis said when they did not have proper understanding of the underlying science. Not only will you make mistakes in halacha if you rely upon incorrect explanations, but you will violate the honor and dignity of those rabbis. Bottom line, as far as our question is concerned, this is the basic point. Molid, giving birth to something new on Shabbos, is indeed one of the prohibitions of Shabbos. Nireh, and it seems to me, he says, Kevan de Katav Rashi, since Rashi wrote, and these are the words of Rashi, Molid davar chadash, karov hu laoseh melacha chadasha, the prohibition of molid, giving birth to something new, is giving birth to something new which is similar to, close to, a violation of Shabbos. The definition of molid, the definition of the prohibition of molid on Shabbos, is doing something which is close to, similar to, a violation of Shabbos. And that too becomes rabbinically prohibited. Ein zeh keshar hashvusim. This is unlike other rabbinic prohibitions. Rather, Chazal prohibited molid in a general way because it's karov l'melacha, and once Chazal, back in the days of the Sanhedrin, prohibited activities which are karov l'melacha, similar to, close to the 39 prohibited labors. Well, imkain, therefore, part of this prohibition of molid can be applied in modern situations, and that is therefore the underlying prohibition of switching on a LED, a light-emitting diode on Shabbos. What you're doing is not literally a violation of Shabbos, but it's close to and similar to a violation of Shabbos, and therefore falls under the rabbinic prohibition of molid. It's this view of the Minchas Osher which is widely accepted by contemporary poskim in the 21st century. So with this, we're going to pause, and I invite you to continue with other shiurim in the Web Yeshiva in our ongoing classes. Well, looking forward to seeing you again in other classes. I wish you a good week and eventually Shabbat Shalom and Kol Tov.
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you very
welcome.
much, Rabbi.
You're
Thank you.
welcome. You're welcome. You're welcome.
Have a Shabbat Shalom.
You too. Shabbat Shalom. Kol Tov.